The blizzard hit the Colorado Rockies like God's own fury, turning the world into a howling white hell that could kill a man in minutes. Thaddeus Grimm had weathered worse storms in his 43 years, but this one carried the kind of malice that made even the mountains themselves seem to shiver in fear. He pressed forward through snow that reached his thighs, following the faint smoke trail he'd spotted from the ridge above. Smoke that shouldn't exist in this godforsaken stretch of wilderness where no sane person would build a shelter. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The abandoned trapper's cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a ghost made solid, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated ice and its windows black as dead eyes. But smoke did indeed rise from the crooked chimney, and as Thaddeus approached the door, he heard something that stopped his blood cold in his veins. A baby's cry, thin and desperate, cutting through the storm's roar like a blade through canvas. He kicked open the door without ceremony, his rifle ready for whatever danger might lurk inside. But what he found drove all thoughts of caution from his mind. A woman lay on the rough wooden floor beside a dying fire, her skin blue-white with cold, her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the frost that had formed on her lips. Beside her, wrapped in what looked like torn pieces of her own clothing, a newborn infant wailed with the fury of something that had entered the world under the worst possible circumstances. Thaddeus dropped his pack and knelt beside the woman, his practiced hands checking for signs of life, while his mind raced through the medical knowledge he'd accumulated during a decade of solitary living. She was alive, barely, but hypothermia was claiming her by degrees. The baby appeared healthier, protected by the last of her body heat and the desperate love that had kept her conscious long enough to ensure its survival. As he lifted the woman to carry her closer to the fire, building it up with dry wood from his pack, something caught his eye that made his heart stop entirely. Her hands, pale and frostbitten though they were, bore distinctive scars across the palms, old marks in the shape of crescents, as if someone had driven nails through her flesh years ago and the wounds had healed badly. Thaddeus had seen those exact scars before, had traced them with his fingers on quiet evenings when the world was peaceful and love seemed like something that could last forever. His wife Evangeline had carried those marks from a childhood accident involving a blacksmith's tools, scars she'd been embarrassed by until he'd convinced her they were beautiful because they were part of her. But Evangeline had been dead for 10 years, lost somewhere in these same mountains during a trading expedition that had gone wrong in ways he'd never fully understood. He'd found her horse, her supplies, even traces of her blood on the rocks near Devil's Canyon, but never her body. Never proof that the woman he'd loved more than his own life was truly gone forever. Now, as he worked to save this mysterious woman and her newborn child, Thaddeus found himself staring into a face that was older, thinner, marked by suffering he couldn't imagine, but unmistakably familiar in the bone structure, the curve of her lips, the way her hair fell across her forehead even in unconsciousness. When the baby stopped crying long enough to open its eyes and look directly at him, Thaddeus felt the world tilt on its axis. Those eyes were the exact shade of green that had haunted his dreams for a decade. Evangeline's eyes, looking at him from the face of a child that couldn't possibly exist. His hands shook as he continued working to save them both, wondering if the isolation and endless searching had finally driven him mad, or if the mountains had just delivered him the most impossible gift in the form of the two people he'd never expected to see alive. 10 years earlier, autumn of 1873, Evangeline Grimm had kissed her husband goodbye on a crisp October morning, her saddlebags packed with furs and trade goods bound for Fort Bridger. The journey was routine. She'd made it dozens of times over their 5 years of marriage, trading their winter's work for supplies that would see them through the harsh mountain months ahead. Thaddeus had wanted to accompany her, but someone needed to stay and prepare their cabin for the snows that would come early that year. "I'll be back in 8 days," she'd promised, her green eyes sparkling with the adventure that always lit up her face when she headed down from their mountain sanctuary into the world below. "Maybe 10 if I can get Peterson to pay what our pelts are really worth." Her laugh had echoed through the pines as she'd ridden away, and Thaddeus had watched until her auburn hair disappeared around the bend, never imagining it would be the last time he'd see her alive. When 12 days passed without her return, Thaddeus had saddled his horse and followed her trail down the mountain, his heart hammering with a dread that grew stronger with each mile. He'd found her horse wandering loose near Devil's Canyon, its saddle twisted and one stirrup torn completely away. The saddlebags were gone, but scattered around the rocky outcrop were items that belonged unmistakably to his wife. A silver hairpin he'd given her for their first anniversary, strips of her blue calico dress caught on the thorns, and worst of all, dark stains on the granite that could only be blood. The search that followed had consumed his life like a fever that never broke. Every winter for a decade, as soon as the snows made trapping impossible, Thaddeus had transformed from mountain man into obsessed detective, following rumors and whispers from trading post to settlement to tribal camp. He'd questioned trappers, traders, soldiers, anyone who might have seen something, heard something, remembered a woman with auburn hair and green eyes who'd vanished into the wilderness. The stories he'd collected painted a picture that chilled him to the bone. Saw riders that day. Old Pete McGillicuddy had told him at Fort Bridger. 6, maybe 7 men on dark horses, moving fast toward Apache country. Had someone with them. Looked like a woman, but couldn't see her face. Thought it strange at the time, white men heading that direction. The Apache territory was forbidden to settlers, a place where ancient treaties and older hatreds made survival unlikely for anyone foolish enough to trespass. Other witnesses had been less reliable, but equally disturbing. A cavalry patrol claimed to have heard screaming from the direction of the sacred peaks, sounds that lasted for hours before falling silent. A half-breed trader spoke of smoke signals that meant valuable cargo in the old Apache tongue, sent from mountain peaks that were supposed to be empty of human life. By the 5th year of searching, Thaddeus had become a legend among the mountain folk, a ghost story told around campfires about the man who couldn't accept his wife's death and wandered the peaks like a lost soul. Some trappers crossed themselves when they saw him approaching, believing he'd been driven mad by grief and isolation. Others offered help or information, understanding the kind of love that could drive a man to spend half his life searching for someone who was almost certainly dead. The most promising lead had come just 2 years ago from a dying prospector named Henry Walsh, who'd grabbed Thaddeus's arm with shaking hands and whispered words that had sent him deeper into the forbidden territories than he'd ever dared go before. Saw her, I did. Woman with hair like fire, kept by the holy men in their hidden valley. Tried to help her once, but they near killed me for it. She's alive, mountain man. God help her. She's alive, but you'll never reach her. Walsh had died before he could say more, but his words had given Thaddeus hope and direction when both had been in short supply. The holy men could only refer to the religious fanatics who were rumored to have established settlements in the most remote mountain valleys. Zealots who'd fled civilization to create their own version of paradise in the wilderness. Now, warming his hands over the fire while the mysterious woman and her baby slept fitfully nearby, Thaddeus wondered if his decade-long search was finally over. The scars on her hands were unmistakable, but 10 years of captivity could change a person beyond recognition. The woman breathing softly in the corner might be his beloved Evangeline, or she might be someone else entirely, another victim of whatever evil had claimed his wife, bearing similar wounds and carrying a child with eyes that merely reminded him of what he'd lost. But as he watched her sleep, noting the way she curled protectively around the baby, even in unconsciousness, Thaddeus felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years of searching. Not just hope, but certainty. His wife was alive, In whatever hell she'd endured to survive this long, they were finally going to go home together. 3 days after the storm, the woman Thaddeus called Seraphina opened her eyes for the first time since he'd found her. But the gaze that met his held no recognition, no spark of memory, only the hollow confusion of someone waking from a nightmare into an unknown world. She sat up slowly, wincing from frostbite damage to her extremities, and immediately reached for the baby he'd been feeding with warm milk from his stores. "Easy now," Thaddeus said gently, handing her the infant, who immediately settled in her arms as if recognizing home. "You've been through hell, but you're safe. I'm Thaddeus. What's your name?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and he watched her face cycle through confusion, fear, and something that looked almost like panic. I can't." Her voice was hoarse from disuse, carrying an accent he couldn't quite place but found hauntingly familiar. "I remember cold, pain, running through snow. But before that," she touched her temple with trembling fingers. "It's all dark, like trying to remember a dream that keeps slipping away." Thaddeus studied her face in the firelight, noting details that both confirmed and contradicted his desperate hope. The bone structure was right, the curve of her lips, the way she held her head when thinking. But she was thinner than Evangeline had ever been, marked by suffering that had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. Most disturbing were the fresh scars, thin white lines across her collarbone, around her wrists, marks that spoke of recent captivity and abuse. "You gave birth in a blizzard," he said carefully, watching for any flicker of recognition. "Do you remember the baby's father? Anyone who might be looking for you?" The question made her clutch the infant closer, and for a moment, terror flashed across her features like lightning. "No," she said too quickly. "No one's looking for me. No one cares." The lie was obvious in her voice, but beneath it lay something that chilled Thaddeus to the bone. The kind of fear that came from knowing exactly who might be pursuing you and what they'd do if they found you. Over the following days, as Seraphina slowly regained her strength, strange details emerged that both fascinated and disturbed Thaddeus. She knew which logs would burn best in the fireplace, where he kept his medical supplies, even the peculiar way his coffee pot handled that only someone familiar with his domestic habits would understand. Yet she couldn't remember her own name or explain how she'd acquired knowledge that suggested years of living in these mountains. "The wind sounds different when a storm's coming from the northwest," she said one evening, listening to the air move through the pines outside. "More hollow, like it's carrying something heavy." It was an observation Thaddeus had made to Evangeline years ago, mountain wisdom he'd learned from his grandfather and passed along to the woman he'd loved. Most unsettling was the way she moved through his cabin, not exploring like a stranger, but navigating with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd once called this place home. She reached for things without looking, avoided the loose floorboard that caught unwary feet, even automatically ducked under the low beam by the door that had troubled Evangeline for months until she'd learned to remember it. The breakthrough came on the fourth night, when Seraphina thought Thaddeus was asleep. She began humming while rocking the baby, a melody so soft he almost missed it. But the tune hit him like a physical blow. It was Barbara Allen, the old ballad his mother had sung to him as a child, which he'd later taught to Evangeline during their courtship. She'd claimed never to have heard it before, but had learned it quickly and often hummed it while doing chores around their cabin. Thaddeus lay still, his heart racing as the familiar melody washed over him. No stranger could know that song, not the specific version with the extra verse his mother had added, the one that existed nowhere except in his family's tradition. If this woman was humming it, she'd learned it from him, which meant she was either Evangeline or someone who'd been very close to Evangeline during her captivity. "That's a beautiful song," he said softly, sitting up. "Where did you learn it?" Seraphina stopped humming immediately, her face going pale in the firelight. I don't know. It just came to me." "Why? Do you know it?" The genuine confusion in her voice convinced him she wasn't lying about her lost memories, but the fact remained that somehow, somewhere, She'd learned a song that only two people in the world should know. My mother used to sing it, Thaddeus said carefully. She taught it to someone I loved very much, someone who disappeared 10 years ago. He studied Seraphina's face for any reaction, but saw only the blank incomprehension of amnesia. Yet as she resumed humming, this time consciously, Thaddeus noticed her fingers moving in a specific pattern against the baby's blanket, the same rhythm Evangeline had always tapped when she was nervous or thinking deeply. The gesture was so familiar, so perfectly Evangeline, that tears began rolling down his cheeks despite his efforts to remain composed. Whether this woman was his wife or someone who'd shared her captivity, one thing was becoming clear. She held the key to mysteries that had tormented him for a decade. And if her memories ever returned, the truths they revealed might be more terrible than the uncertainty he'd lived with for 10 long years of searching. 10 years ago, in fragmented memories that returned like broken glass. The riders had come out of nowhere as Evangeline watered her horse at Devil's Creek. 6 men in dark clothes with eyes that burned with fanatic fervor. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair and a voice like honey poured over poison, had spoken to her with the confidence of someone who'd been watching her for weeks, learning her habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Evangeline Grimm, he'd said, not a question but a statement of fact that had frozen her blood. Daughter of Martha and James Whitfield, granddaughter of Rebecca Whitfield, who bore the mark of the chosen. You've been selected for a holy purpose, sister. Come willingly, and no harm will befall your husband in his mountain retreat. The threat against Thaddeus had ended any thought of resistance. These men knew where she lived, knew who she loved, and the casual way their leader mentioned her husband's safety told her that running would only delay the inevitable while signing Thaddeus's death warrant. She'd gone with them quietly, her heart breaking as they'd led her horse away and left it to wander, knowing Thaddeus would find the animal and assume the worst. The journey to their hidden settlement had taken 4 days through mountain passes she'd never seen, ancient trails that seemed to exist outside the normal geography of the Colorado Rockies. Prophet Ezekiel Kane, as he insisted she call him, had ridden beside her the entire way, speaking of bloodlines and destiny with the passionate intensity of a man who'd found God in the wilderness and decided to rewrite divine scripture to suit his own desires. Your great-grandmother carried the mark, he told her as they climbed toward peaks that touched the clouds. The crescent scars that appear on the palms of women chosen to bear the pure children who will inherit this corrupted earth. Rebecca died before she could fulfill her purpose, but the gift passed to your grandmother, then your mother, and now to you. Evangeline had looked at her own palms, at the crescents carved there by a childhood accident with her father's blacksmithing tools, and felt sick understanding Dawn. What she'd always seen as unfortunate scars, Cain viewed as divine marking that proved her worthiness to serve his twisted vision of paradise. The settlement itself had been a monument to organized madness, a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be defended by a handful of men with rifles. Wooden buildings arranged around a central temple, gardens tended by women in identical gray dresses, children who moved with the eerie obedience of those raised in absolute fear. Cain had ruled this place like a king, his word treated as divine law by followers who'd surrendered their capacity for independent thought. You'll bear children who will inherit the earth, Cain had explained as he'd shown her the cabin that would be her prison. Pure souls untainted by the corruption of the outside world, raised in righteousness to lead humanity back to grace. The words had been delivered with such conviction that Evangeline had realized she was dealing with someone who genuinely believed his own delusions. But it was the presence of other women, all bearing the same crescent scars, that had truly shown her the scope of Cain's operation. He'd been collecting marked women for years, building a breeding population that would produce his vision of perfect children. Some had been there so long they'd forgotten their real names, their former lives, everything except their role as vessels for Cain's genetic theology. The worst part had been the slow realization that resistance was not just futile, but potentially deadly for everyone she'd grown to care about. Cain's followers included several of the women's own family members, brothers, fathers, even mothers who'd been convinced that sacrificing their daughters served a higher purpose. Escape meant leaving behind women who'd become sisters in suffering, abandoning them to face Cain's wrath alone. Mary Hutchinson had been the first to die trying to flee. Evangeline had watched from her cabin window as Cain's son Mordecai had dragged the girl back from the canyon entrance, had seen the trial, where Cain pronounced her corruption irreversible, had heard the gunshot that ended a life deemed no longer useful to the community's divine mission. After Mary's death, Evangeline had stopped planning escape and started planning survival. She'd learned to appear broken while remaining whole inside, to seem compliant while cataloging every weakness in their security, to bear Cain's children while secretly preparing for the day when escape might become possible without abandoning the other women to certain death. 9 years of captivity had taught her patience, cunning, and the ability to endure suffering that would have destroyed a weaker spirit. She'd given Cain 3 children who'd been taken from her at birth and raised by other families within the community, watched her body and mind pushed to their limits, felt pieces of her soul die with each passing season. But she'd never stopped being Evangeline Grimm, never stopped loving the mountain man who was certainly searching for her, never stopped believing that someday she'd find a way back to the life that had been stolen from her on a crisp October morning when the world still made sense. The final escape had come during the birth of her 4th child, when sympathetic hands had helped her flee into a blizzard that should have killed her, but instead delivered her back to the man who'd never stopped believing she was alive. Now, as fragments of memory returned like scattered pieces of a shattered mirror, Evangeline began to understand both how much she'd lost and how much she'd somehow managed to preserve during 10 years in hell. The memories returned like water through a broken dam, each fragment more devastating than the last. Serafina, Evangeline, she now remembered with crystalline clarity, sat by the fire in Thaddeus's cabin, holding the baby who represented both her greatest shame and her most precious victory. The child's father was Prophet Cain, the monster who'd held her captive for nearly a decade. But this baby was also her ticket to freedom, born during the one moment when the cult's guard had been lowered. "My God," she whispered, her voice cracking as the full weight of lost years crashed down on her. "Thaddeus, it's me. It's really me." The words came out broken, desperate, carrying 10 years of pain and hope and the kind of love that had somehow survived even Cain's systematic attempts to destroy it. Thaddeus was beside her in an instant, his weathered hands gentle on her face as he searched her eyes for the woman he'd loved and lost. "Evangeline, I knew it was you. I never stopped looking, never stopped believing." His voice broke on the words, and she saw tears streaming down the face that had aged a decade in the mountains, marked by years of searching and solitude. But even as they held each other, the terrible truths she'd remembered cast shadows over their reunion. "The baby," she said, pulling back to look at the infant who'd saved her life by providing the opportunity to escape. "Her name is Faith. I gave birth to her 3 days ago, and Thaddeus, she's not yours." The pain that flashed across his features nearly broke her heart, but she saw him master it with the same strength that had kept him searching for 10 years. "Whose?" he asked quietly, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Prophet Cain's," she confirmed, watching his face harden with rage that burned cold as mountain winter. He made me bear 4 children during my captivity. This was the 4th. But Thaddeus, she's innocent in all this. And she's the reason I was finally able to escape." The story poured out of her in painful waves. How Cain had selected women with specific bloodline markers, believing their children would be blessed with supernatural abilities that would help his followers inherit the earth. How she'd been forced to play the role of willing participant while secretly preparing for escape. learning the routines and weaknesses of guards who thought broken spirits posed no threat. There was a woman named Constance who'd been there 15 years, Evangeline continued, her voice strengthening with each revelation. She helped deliver my children, and she never stopped believing that someday we'd find a way out. When I went into labor with Faith, she was the one who suggested we wait for the worst blizzard of the season. The plan had been desperate but carefully orchestrated. Constance had convinced Cain that Evangeline needed to be moved to the berthing cabin on the edge of the settlement, a structure built near the canyon entrance for emergencies. During the height of the storm, when visibility dropped to zero and even Cain's most devoted followers sought shelter, Constance had helped Evangeline escape through a hidden exit she'd been working on for years. She gave me supplies, clothes, everything she could spare, Evangeline said, tears flowing freely now. And she stayed behind to face Cain's wrath, to protect the other women, to give me the time I needed to get far enough away that the storm would cover my tracks. Thaddeus listened without interruption as she described the nightmare journey through the blizzard, carrying a newborn infant through mountain wilderness that would have challenged an experienced trapper. She'd been guided by memory and desperation, following half-remembered trails from her youth toward the abandoned trapper's cabin where she'd once played as a child visiting her grandfather. I almost didn't make it, she admitted, looking down at Faith, who slept peacefully despite being born into circumstances that should have killed them both. I could feel the cold taking me, but every time I wanted to give up, I thought about you, about the possibility that you might still be out there, still searching, still believing I was alive. But even as they shared this reunion, both of them understood the danger they now faced. Cain would never stop hunting for his chosen vessel, and the child he believed was destined to lead his followers to promised glory. The cult's reach extended far beyond their hidden valley, with sympathizers and spies throughout the territory who reported unusual events or strangers asking suspicious questions. "They'll come for us," Evangeline said, reading the same understanding in Thaddeus's eyes. Cain believes Faith is some kind of prophesied Messiah, and he'll never accept losing her. He has followers who've been searching for escapees for years, and they're patient, methodical, absolutely devoted to bringing back anyone who threatens the community's divine mission. Thaddeus stood and moved to the window, his trained eye scanning the mountain slopes for any sign of approaching danger. 10 years of searching had honed his survival instincts to a razor's edge, and he could feel something shifting in the mountain's rhythm, a disturbance in the natural order that suggested they were no longer alone in the wilderness. "How long before they track us here?" he asked, checking his weapons with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent a decade ready for violence. Evangeline calculated quickly, considering the storm's duration, the difficulty of following tracks through fresh snow, and Cain's resources for mounting a pursuit. "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. But they will find us, Thaddeus." Cain has been preparing for this possibility for years. He has men who know these mountains as well as you do, and they're motivated by religious fanaticism that makes them incredibly dangerous. As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed across the mountain silence. The distant howl of wolves that didn't quite sound like wolves, a hunting call that carried too much intelligence and purpose to be purely animal. Evangeline's blood turned to ice as she recognized the signal Cain's scouts used to communicate across vast distances. "They're already here," she whispered, gathering Faith closer to her chest. "The hunt has begun." They came at dawn like shadows given substance. 8 men in dark winter clothing moving through the snow with the silent coordination of wolves who'd hunted together for years. Thaddeus spotted them from his hidden observation post above the cabin, their leader unmistakably Mordecai Cain, the prophet's son, whose pale eyes burned with the same fanatic fervor that had driven his father to madness. Evangeline Grimm. Mordecai's voice carried clearly through the mountain air as his men surrounded the cabin. "Chosen vessel of the prophet, bearer of the sacred child, your time of wandering in the wilderness is over. Come forth and return to your holy purpose." Inside the cabin, Evangeline pressed Faith closer to her chest, the baby's green eyes seeming to understand the danger even at 4 days old. "He won't take her alive if he can't take us both," she whispered to Thaddeus, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Cain would rather see Faith dead than raised outside the community. He believes corruption spreads like disease. Thaddeus checked his rifle one final time, counting ammunition that would have to last against 8 trained killers who fought with the desperate conviction of true believers. But as he prepared for battle, movement in the tree line caught his attention, a ninth figure hanging back from the main group, someone whose posture suggested reluctance rather than eagerness for the coming confrontation. "Sister," the distant figure called out, and Evangeline's face went white as recognition hit her like a physical blow. "It's Tobias. My brother Tobias is with them." The revelation struck deeper than any knife could have, because it meant her own family had betrayed her, had been part of Cain's network from the very beginning. Mordecai's patience was wearing thin. "You have 1 minute to emerge voluntarily, or we'll come in and drag you out. The child belongs to the prophet, and interference from outsiders will not be tolerated." His men began moving closer to the cabin, their weapons ready but held low. They wanted Evangeline and Faith alive, which might be the only advantage Thaddeus possessed. "Why?" Evangeline whispered, staring at her brother's silhouette through the window. "Why would he join them? We were raised together, loved each other, protected each other. How could he help them take me?" But there was no time for answers as Mordecai's deadline expired and his men began their final approach. Thaddeus had prepared for this moment during 10 years of planning theoretical rescues, and now muscle memory took over as he triggered the first of several traps he'd built around his mountain sanctuary. The explosion of the buried black powder charge sent 2 of Cain's followers flying through the air, their screams echoing off the mountain walls as snow and debris rained down around them. The remaining attackers dove for cover, suddenly realizing they were dealing with someone who'd turned the entire area into a battlefield prepared specifically for defense against superior numbers. "Tobias," Evangeline called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Whatever they told you, whatever they promised you, this is wrong. I'm your sister. How can you help them hunt me like an animal?" The figure in the tree line stepped forward, revealing a man in his 30s whose face bore the hollow look of someone who'd surrendered his soul for promises that had never been kept. "They said you were corrupted," he called back, his voice carrying a decade of guilt and rationalization. "Said the mountain man had poisoned your mind against the prophet's truth. I thought if I helped bring you back, you could be purified, made whole again." Mordecai's rage at the tactical setback was immediately directed toward Tobias. "Silence. You're here to guide us, not to negotiate with the enemy. The prophet's will is absolute, and doubt is corruption." The threat in his voice was clear. Tobias's usefulness had limits, and those limits were being tested. Thaddeus used the distraction to trigger his second defensive measure, a carefully positioned rock slide that blocked the main approach to the cabin while creating chaos among the attackers. 2 more of Cain's men went down, trapped under boulders, but Mordecai and his remaining followers adapted quickly, spreading out to attack from multiple angles. "They're not going to give up," Evangeline said, loading Thaddeus's spare rifle with practiced efficiency. 10 years of captivity hadn't made her helpless. If anything, it had taught her that survival sometimes required violence, and she was prepared to kill to protect her daughter's freedom. But as bullets began splintering the cabin's walls and the sound of breaking glass announced the beginning of the final assault, it became clear that defensive measures alone wouldn't be enough. Mordecai's men were willing to die for their cause, and their leader's tactical skills were proving formidable despite the initial setbacks. "There's a way out through the root cellar," Thaddeus said, making a decision that went against every instinct he possessed. "Tunnel leads to a cave system about half a mile down the mountain. You take Faith and go. I'll hold them here as long as I can." Evangeline's response was immediate and fierce. "No, we leave together or we die together. I won't lose you again, not after 10 years of hoping for this moment." The determination in her voice reminded Thaddeus exactly why he'd fallen in love with her originally. She was the strongest person he'd ever known, and a decade of suffering hadn't broken that core of steel. As if responding to their unity, Faith began making soft sounds that weren't quite crying but seemed to carry an otherworldly resonance. The baby's green eyes fixed on the window where gunfire flickered, and for a moment, the shooting outside faltered as something in her presence affected even Cain's fanatic followers. "She's going to be special," Evangeline said, wonder mixing with determination in her voice. "Not the way Cain believes, but truly special. And we're going to make sure she grows up free to choose her own destiny." The siege of Thaddeus's cabin had begun, but the mountain man who'd spent 10 years preparing for this moment was ready to discover exactly how far love and desperation could push two people fighting for their family's survival. Winter locked the mountain in its iron grip, trapping hunters and hunted alike in a deadly game of survival that would test everything Thaddeus had learned during his decade of solitary living. The blizzard that had been building all morning finally unleashed its full fury, turning the world into a white hell where visibility dropped to mere feet and the wind howled like tortured spirits seeking vengeance. "Now," Thaddeus whispered, as Mordecai's men took shelter from the storm and momentarily ceased their assault on the cabin. He led Evangeline and Faith through the hidden root cellar entrance, into tunnels he'd spent years excavating as emergency escape routes. The baby remained eerily quiet, as if she understood that silence meant survival in the deadly game being played above their heads. The tunnel system was Thaddeus's masterpiece, carved through solid rock and reinforced with timber, connecting his cabin to 3 different exit points scattered across the mountain. But more than escape routes, they were supply caches filled with weapons, ammunition, food, and tools he'd stockpiled for exactly this kind of siege warfare. 10 years of expecting the worst had prepared him for war. "You've been planning for this," Evangeline said with growing amazement as they moved through passages lit by carefully placed oil lamps. "All these years, you knew someday you'd have to fight for me." The realization that his obsessive preparation had been driven by hope rather than paranoia brought tears to her eyes. They emerged at the first cache, a hidden cave where Thaddeus had stored enough supplies to last months. But as they prepared to continue deeper into the mountain, Evangeline suddenly stopped, her face going pale with a recognition that had nothing to do with recovered memory. "This place," she whispered, looking around the natural cave with its ancient petroglyphs and carved symbols. "Cain brought me here once, during my first year of captivity. He said this mountain was sacred to his mission, that the power sleeping in these rocks would amplify Faith's gifts when she was old enough to claim her destiny." Thaddeus felt ice form in his stomach as he realized the implications. "What kind of power?" "Apache burial ground," Evangeline said, pointing to symbols carved into the cave walls by hands long dead. "But older than that." Cain claimed the original inhabitants were wiped out by Spanish conquistadors who recognized the spiritual significance of this place. He believed their bones and spirits remained, waiting for someone pure enough to channel their accumulated wisdom and strength. The revelation cast their struggle in a completely different light. They weren't just fighting for their family's survival. They were battling for control of something Cain viewed as a supernatural resource that would validate his twisted theology and grant him power beyond anything purely human. "That's why he can't let Faith go," Evangeline continued, her understanding growing with each passing moment. "It's not just about losing a child he believes is destined for greatness. It's about losing access to whatever force he thinks dwells in these mountains. Without Faith, his entire prophetic mission collapses into the delusions of a madman." Above them, the storm was masking movement as Mordecai's surviving men regrouped and began searching for the escape routes they knew had to exist. But Thaddeus had advantages beyond preparation and knowledge of the terrain. He'd learned to think like the Apache warriors who'd once defended these peaks, using the mountain itself as an ally in warfare against invaders. "There's something else," Evangeline said as they moved deeper into the cave system. During my captivity, I wasn't just surviving. I was planning. Cain trusted me enough to show me things, tell me secrets, because he believed I was broken and harmless. Her smile was sharp as winter wind. He was wrong about both assumptions. From hidden pockets in her clothing, she began producing items that made Thaddeus's eyes widen. Hand-drawn maps of Cain's settlement, lists of his followers' names and weaknesses, detailed information about guard rotations and defensive positions, even samples of the poison Cain used to maintain control over doubters within his community. 10 years of intelligence gathering, she said with grim satisfaction. Every conversation I overheard, every weakness I observed, every piece of information that might someday help destroy that place and free the women still trapped there. I never stopped being your wife, Thaddeus. I just learned to hide it behind a mask Cain wanted to see. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels, but now they were ready. Thaddeus had weapons positioned at strategic choke points, while Evangeline's knowledge of their enemy's psychology gave them tactical advantages no amount of preparation could have provided. Tobias will be leading them, she said with certainty. Mordecai knows these mountains, but my brother knows how I think, how I move, where I might try to hide. Cain sent him along as a bloodhound to track his own sister. But as torchlight flickered in the tunnel entrance and voices carried through the stone passages, Faith began making those strange musical sounds again, notes that seemed to resonate in the cave walls themselves. The ancient symbols carved by Apache hands began to glow faintly, as if the baby's presence was awakening something that had slept in these rocks for centuries. "Dear God," Evangeline whispered, staring at the phenomenon with mixture of wonder and terror. Cain was right about this place being special, but he was wrong about controlling whatever lives here. The mountain itself was choosing sides in the battle for Faith's future, and the power stirring in the sacred darkness around them was about to teach everyone involved exactly what it meant to wage war in a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had worn dangerously thin. As Mordecai's hunting party entered the cave system, they were about to discover that some territories defended themselves, and some children were protected by forces far older and more dangerous than human fanaticism could ever hope to challenge. Tobias Whitfield moved through the sacred caves like a man walking toward his own execution, his torch casting dancing shadows on petroglyphs that seemed to watch him with ancient judgment. Behind him, Mordecai Cain's remaining followers whispered prayers to their twisted god, but ahead of him waited a confrontation with the sister he'd betrayed 10 years ago for promises that had turned to ash in his mouth. "I can smell her fear," Mordecai hissed, his pale eyes reflecting torchlight like a predator's. "The chosen vessel knows her time of rebellion is ending. The child will be returned to the prophet's embrace, and order will be restored to the sacred bloodline." But even as he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that suggested the cave's growing spiritual resonance was affecting even Cain's most devoted follower. Faith's musical sounds grew stronger as they approached, harmonizing with something deep in the mountain's bones that made the cave walls pulse with faint golden light. The Apache symbols carved centuries ago began glowing brighter, and several of Cain's men crossed themselves nervously, their fanatic confidence wavering in the face of phenomena their theology couldn't explain. "Sister," Tobias called out when they reached the chamber where Thaddeus and Evangeline waited with weapons ready. "I know you're there. Let me talk to you. Just talk. Please." The desperation in his voice was genuine, carrying 10 years of guilt that had been eating him alive like spiritual cancer. Evangeline stepped into the torchlight, Faith cradled in her arms, her face showing the complex mixture of love and betrayal that defined their relationship. "Why, Tobias? Why did you help them take me? I trusted you. I loved you. We were family." The question hit him like a physical blow, and Tobias felt tears streaming down his face as memories he'd been suppressing for a decade came flooding back. "They killed them," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Our parents. Cain killed them when they refused to give you up, and I was there. I watched it happen and did nothing to stop it. The revelation sent shockwaves through everyone present. Even Mordecai looked surprised, suggesting Cain had kept certain truths hidden even from his most trusted followers. But Tobias was beyond caring about consequences now. The dam of his guilt finally bursting after years of careful containment. Cain told me it was an accident. He continued, his words coming out in broken gasps. Said they'd been attacked by outlaws, that he'd tried to save them but arrived too late. He offered me belonging, purpose, a chance to honor their memory by protecting their daughter who carried sacred markings. I was 18, scared, alone in the world. I believed his lies because I needed them to be true. Evangeline's face showed the complex emotions of someone processing betrayal and understanding simultaneously. When did you learn the truth? 5 years ago, Tobias admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper of shame. I overheard Cain telling Mordecai about the lesson he'd taught parents who thought they could defy the prophet's divine will. He laughed about it. Laughed about murdering our mother and father because they loved their daughter too much to sell her to a madman. Mordecai's patience finally snapped. Enough of this weakness. The past is irrelevant. Seize the woman and child, or I'll report your failure to the prophet myself. His hand moved to his weapon, but he found himself facing not just Thaddeus's rifle, but the growing power radiating from Faith herself. The baby's musical sounds had become something more than human vocalization, resonating with frequencies that made the cave walls vibrate and the ancient symbols pulse with increasing intensity. Whatever spiritual force dwelt in these sacred rocks was responding to Faith's presence, and it was becoming clear that the child possessed abilities that went far beyond Cain's crude understanding. Look at her, Evangeline said, holding Faith so everyone could see the golden aura that was beginning to surround the infant. Really look at her. This isn't about prophecy or divine bloodlines or any of Cain's delusions. She's something entirely new, something that transcends all your categories and control. The power building around Faith was affecting everyone differently. Thaddeus felt peace settling over his spirit, while Mordecai and his men seemed to be struggling against some force that was stripping away their fanatical certainty. But Tobias was experiencing something else entirely, a purging of the guilt and self-hatred that had driven him to serve Cain for a decade. The child must not be corrupted by outside influences, Mordecai snarled, raising his rifle toward Faith despite the growing supernatural pressure in the cave. If she cannot be returned pure, she must be prevented from serving evil purposes. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Tobias moved with desperate speed, throwing himself between the weapon and his sister's child. The bullet meant for Faith struck him in the chest, and he collapsed to the cave floor with blood spreading across his shirt like spilled wine. No! Evangeline screamed, dropping to her knees beside her dying brother while still protecting Faith from the chaos erupting around them. But as Tobias's blood touched the sacred ground, something extraordinary happened. The cave's spiritual energy focused itself through Faith's infant form and poured into the wounded man, not healing his body, but cleansing his soul in ways that 10 years of guilt had made necessary. I see them, Tobias whispered, his eyes focusing on something beyond the physical world. Mother and father. They're here, they're proud of me, they forgive me. His hand reached toward Faith, and when the baby's tiny fingers touched his, golden light flowed between them like a bridge connecting life and death. Tell Cain, Tobias said to Mordecai, his voice growing stronger even as his body weakened. Tell the prophet that the real power in these mountains doesn't serve men who claim to speak for God. Tell him his prophesied child has chosen a different destiny, and no amount of fanatic devotion will change that. As Tobias drew his final breath, the cave's spiritual energy reached critical mass, and Faith's true nature finally revealed itself. She wasn't just a child with unusual abilities. She was something fundamentally new, a bridge between worlds that could heal wounds that had festered for generations. The redemption of Tobias Whitfield had begun, but the real battle for Faith's future was just beginning. Prophet Ezekiel Cain arrived at the sacred cave like a dark angel of judgment, his silver hair whipping in the mountain wind, and his eyes burning with the kind of madness that comes from 20 years of absolute power over desperate souls. Behind him rode the last of his devoted followers, men who'd abandoned their humanity so completely that they moved like extensions of his twisted will rather than independent beings. Mordecai. Cain's voice echoed through the cave system with the authority of someone who'd never been denied anything he truly wanted. Where is my chosen vessel? Where is the child who will lead us to the promised glory? But even as he spoke, the growing spiritual energy in the caves was affecting him, stripping away layers of carefully constructed delusion to reveal the broken man beneath. Evangeline stepped forward from the chamber where Tobias's body lay surrounded by golden light. Faith cradled in her arms like a living torch that illuminated truths Cain had spent decades trying to hide from himself. I'm here, Ezekiel. The woman you stole, the mother you tortured, the vessel you tried to break. But I'm not your property anymore, and neither is my daughter. Cain's face cycled through emotions too complex for his fractured psyche to process. Rage, possessiveness, fear, and underneath it all, a terrible recognition that his entire theology was crumbling in the presence of genuine spiritual power that owed him nothing and served no master but love itself. You belong to me, he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Both of you, the sacred bloodline, the prophesied child, the destiny I've spent my life preparing. None of it can be fulfilled without your willing participation in God's plan. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, prayers to a deity who'd stopped listening years ago. Thaddeus stepped beside his wife, his rifle trained on the madman who'd stolen 10 years of their lives together. She belongs to herself, and the baby belongs to whoever she chooses to trust with a child's future. Your plan ends here, Cain. Your followers are dead or scattered. Your power is broken, and the only God in these caves doesn't answer to fanatics. But Cain's madness ran deeper than anyone had realized. As Faith's golden aura continued to intensify, revealing the true nature of the power dwelling in the sacred mountain, the prophet's grip on reality finally snapped completely. He began laughing, the sound echoing off the cave walls like the cries of something that had forgotten how to be human. You think this changes anything? He shrieked, pulling a knife from his robes and pressing it to his own throat. I've given everything to prepare for this moment. My sanity, my humanity, my soul. If I cannot have the child, then no one will. The blade drew blood as his hand trembled with the intensity of his conviction. Faith's response was immediate and overwhelming. Her musical sounds crescendoed into something that transcended mere vocalization, becoming a harmony that seemed to include every voice that had ever suffered in these mountains. Apache warriors defending their sacred ground, Spanish conquistadors dying far from home, trappers lost in blizzards, women who died bearing children they'd never lived to raise. The golden light radiating from the infant grew so bright that everyone in the cave had to shield their eyes. But within that radiance, impossible things began to manifest. Tobias's spirit appeared beside his sister, no longer bearing the wounds of betrayal, but shining with the peace of someone who'd found redemption through sacrifice. Other figures materialized around them, Apache elders offering protection, Evangeline's murdered parents extending forgiveness, even some of Cain's victims reaching out with compassion rather than vengeance. Do you see them? Evangeline asked Cain gently, her voice cutting through his madness with the clarity of absolute truth. Do you see all the people your fear and hatred have destroyed? They're not here for revenge, Ezekiel. They're here to offer you the same forgiveness you've spent your life believing you didn't deserve. Cain's knife fell from nerveless fingers as he stared at the spiritual gathering surrounding Faith's radiant form. Among the figures reaching toward him with expressions of peace, he recognized faces from his own past, the wife and children he'd abandoned when he'd first fled into the wilderness, the brother he'd betrayed to fund his early religious experiments, the hundreds of followers whose lives he'd destroyed through his increasingly twisted interpretation of divine will. "I was trying to save them," he whispered, his voice breaking as 20 years of carefully suppressed guilt finally overwhelmed his psychological defenses. "All of them. I thought if I could create perfect children, pure souls untainted by the world's corruption, then maybe God would forgive me for all the terrible things I'd done in His name." The spirits surrounding them didn't speak with words, but their presence communicated forgiveness so complete and unconditional that even Cain's shattered psyche could recognize it. Faith's power wasn't about judgment or punishment. It was about healing wounds so deep they'd been poisoning everything they touched for generations. "The children you took from me," Evangeline said, kneeling beside the broken man who'd been her captor for so long. "Are they happy? Are they safe?" Even now, after everything he'd done to her, her first concern was for the welfare of others who'd suffered because of his delusions. Cain's face crumpled as he realized the final, devastating truth about his life's work. "They're gone," he sobbed. "All of them. Taken by fever 3 winters ago when I refused to let the outside doctor enter our settlement. I convinced myself it was God's will, that they were too pure for this corrupted world. But they died because of my pride, my certainty that I knew better than anyone else what heaven wanted." The confession shattered the last of his defenses, and Ezekiel Cain collapsed completely, 20 years of accumulated madness and guilt pouring out of him like poison from a lanced wound. In the golden light of faith's presence, surrounded by spirits offering forgiveness he'd never believed possible, the prophet finally became what he'd always been underneath the delusions, a broken man who tried to fix his own spiritual wounds by inflicting them on others. Faith's power reached its crescendo, and the sacred mountain itself seemed to exhale with relief as decades of accumulated violence and hatred were finally purged from the ancient stones. The child who'd been born in a blizzard had become something unprecedented, not a weapon of divine judgment, but an instrument of healing that could transform even the deepest corruption into something approaching peace. As Cain wept for the lives he'd destroyed and the love he'd rejected, Evangeline looked at Thaddeus with eyes that held 10 years of pain, but also the promise of whatever time they had left together. Their ordeal was ending, but their real life was just beginning. 3 months later, as winter's grip finally loosened, the federal marshals had come and gone, taking the broken remnants of Cain's cult into custody while marveling at testimony that read more like religious revelation than criminal investigation. Prophet Ezekiel Cain himself had been committed to an asylum back east, his mind finally at peace but too shattered by guilt and revelation to ever again pose a threat to anyone. The women he'd held captive for years were slowly being reunited with families who'd given them up for dead, their healing beginning with the understanding that their suffering hadn't been meaningless. Thaddeus stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching Evangeline tend the garden she'd started as soon as the snow began melting. Faith lay in a basket beside her, now 4 months old, and displaying the kind of serene contentment that seemed to spread to everyone in her presence. The baby's unusual abilities were growing stronger. She could calm crying animals with a touch, make flowers bloom out of season with her laughter, and bring peace to hearts that had forgotten what tranquility felt like. "The mountain's different now," Evangeline said, not looking up from the seedlings she was transplanting. "Lighter somehow, as if something that had been trapped here for generations finally found a way to move on." The sacred caves had been sealed by Apache elders who'd returned to reclaim their ancestral burial ground. But the spiritual transformation that had occurred there continued to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Marshall Williams had stayed for a week, documenting evidence and taking statements. But even his professional skepticism had been worn down by witnessing Faith's effect on hardened criminals who'd accompanied Cain's hunting party. Men who'd committed atrocities in the name of twisted faith found themselves weeping for their victims, confessing crimes that hadn't even been suspected, seeking forgiveness they'd never believed they deserved. She's going to be extraordinary, Williams had told them before departing. Not in the way that maniac Kane believed, but in ways that might actually heal some of the wounds this territory has been carrying for too long. He'd arranged for federal protection of their valley, ensuring that other fanatics wouldn't try to claim faith for their own purposes. The most unexpected visitor had been Constance Mueller, the woman who'd helped Evangeline escape during the blizzard. She'd survived Kane's rage after the escape, protected by other cult members who'd been quietly planning their own rebellion for years. Now free, she'd chosen to stay in the valley and help raise the child whose birth had catalyzed everyone's liberation. Faith healed something in me too, Constance had explained, watching the baby gurgle contentedly in the morning sunlight. 20 years of captivity had convinced me I was nothing more than what Kane said I was. But when I helped you escape, when I chose love over fear, I remembered who I used to be before the madness claimed us all. The rebuilding hadn't been just physical. Evangeline carried scars from her decade of captivity that would take years to fully heal, moments when shadows fell wrong and sent her back to Kane's settlement, nightmares that woke her screaming for children who'd been taken from her arms. But Faith's presence seemed to accelerate the healing process, not erasing the trauma, but transforming it into something that strengthened rather than weakened her spirit. I dreamed about Tobias last night, Evangeline said, finally looking up from her garden to meet Thaddeus's eyes. He was young again, the way he was before Kane poisoned his mind with guilt. He said to tell you thank you for giving his sister back her life. The spiritual visitations had become common since Faith's birth, as if the child's presence made communication between worlds easier for those who needed closure. Thaddeus watched his wife work with soil and seeds, marveling at how someone who'd endured such systematic cruelty could still believe in growth and renewal. The woman tending her garden bore scars on her hands and shadows in her eyes, but her core remained unbroken, perhaps stronger than it had been before her ordeal began. As if sensing his thoughts, Faith began making her musical sounds, notes that seemed to harmonize with the wind in the pines and the creek running past their cabin. Birds responded to her voice, gathering in the nearby trees to add their own songs to her impossible melody. Even the mountain itself seemed to listen, its ancient peaks catching and amplifying the sound until the entire valley resonated with something approaching joy. "What do you think she'll become?" Evangeline asked, settling beside Thaddeus with Faith in her arms. "When she's older, when her abilities fully manifest, what kind of person will she choose to be?" Thaddeus studied the infant who'd already transformed so many lives simply by existing, noting the intelligence in her green eyes and the way she seemed to respond to emotions and intentions rather than just sounds and movements. "Whatever she wants to be," he said firmly, "that's the gift we can give her. The freedom to choose her own destiny instead of having it chosen for her by people who think they know better." A rider approached their valley as afternoon shadows lengthened, but Faith's contented sounds told them this was a friend rather than a threat. Dr. Sarah Henderson from the territorial capital had been making monthly visits, documenting Faith's development for medical journals while providing the kind of regular health care that isolated mountain families rarely received. "Her abilities are stabilizing," Dr. Henderson reported after her examination. "Whatever she is, she's becoming it gradually, naturally, without the kind of traumatic manifestation we might have expected from someone with her unusual gifts." The doctor had become something of a protector as well as a physician, using her influence to deflect attention from curiosity seekers and researchers who wanted to study Faith like a fascinating specimen. As evening settled over their mountain sanctuary, the three adults sat around the fireplace, while Faith slept peacefully in the cradle Thaddeus had carved during the long winter nights. The baby's presence had transformed their home into something that felt genuinely sacred, not in the twisted way Kane had understood holiness, but in the simple recognition that love, when allowed to grow without interference, could heal wounds that had seemed permanent. 10 years, Evangeline said softly, her hand finding Thaddeus's in the firelight. 10 years I was gone, but somehow we found our way back to each other. And now we have her. She looked at Faith, whose sleeping form seemed to glow faintly in the dancing shadows. I think that's what real miracles look like. Not dramatic interventions from above, but love that refuses to give up, hope that survives impossible circumstances, and the courage to keep believing in better tomorrows. Outside their cabin, spring was returning to the Colorado Rockies with unusual abundance. Flowers bloomed earlier and more vibrantly than anyone could remember. Animals that had been driven away by years of violence began returning to the valley. Even the weather seemed gentler, as if Faith's influence extended to the natural world around her. The child born in a snowstorm had brought more than survival to a family torn apart by madness. She brought renewal to an entire territory that had forgotten what peace looked like. And in the mountain cabin where love had finally triumphed over fear, three people who'd learned the hard way that some bonds can't be broken began planning a future that promised to be as extraordinary as the child whose birth had made it possible. If this story of love's triumph over the darkest circumstances touched your heart, subscribe to this channel for more incredible tales where hope conquers despair and families find their way back to each other against impossible odds. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing stories from America's frontier, where the power of love could overcome even the most twisted evil.